In modern philosophy and science, what is commonly called Platonism is usually identified with Plato's theory of forms. Within this interpretation, those who describe themselves as Platonists generally believe in a realm of eternal truths, most often understood as mathematical truths or abstract principles. Although this interpretation contains an element of Plato's philosophy, a closer examination of the role that the forms play in Plato's own thought reveals something very different. When we compare the meaning that the theory of forms has in modern discussions with the role it serves in Plato's philosophy, it becomes clear that many contemporary thinkers who call themselves Platonists actually understand the theory in a way that is the complete opposite of Plato's original vision. Plato is frequently described as a rationalist, but his understanding of rationality is fundamentally different from what modern people usually mean by the term. Rationality is not merely the ability to solve mathematical equations, analyze concepts, or reason through problems. For Plato, reason is an ontological feature of reality itself, expressed equally within the cosmos and within the human soul. Reality is a living rational organism, just as the soul is a living rational organism. His conception of reason belongs to the structure of being rather than to abstract concepts, and his mathematics is divine rather than merely physical. Plato should therefore be understood as a Pythagorean metaphysician of life, not as a mathematician concerned with abstract objects. From my perspective, anyone who rejects the idea that reality is literally a living organism, or who denies the existence of the soul and the divine, cannot truly call themselves a Platonist. Many modern thinkers who identify with Platonism speak instead about an abstract mathematical realm completely separated from spirit and divinity. Yet this sacred dimension is precisely what gives the theory of forms its meaning. If Plato had not believed in a divine and spiritual reality, he would never have developed such a theory in the first place. The forms only make sense when understood within the religious and metaphysical framework of Platonism. Remove the divine, and the theory of forms ceases to be Plato's theory at all. It is inseparable from God and the soul, and without these realities it is no longer genuine Platonism. Those who imagine otherwise fundamentally misunderstand what Plato intended. To understand Plato properly, one must recognize that Platonism is also a religion. It is not merely a philosophical system composed of logical arguments. Rather, it is a religious vision that expresses itself through philosophical reasoning. Whenever I hear modern atheist physicists describe themselves as Platonists, I cannot help but think they have never seriously engaged with Plato's dialogues. Had they done so, they would immediately recognize that these writings resemble sacred texts, filled with myths, symbols, and profound expressions of the divine. Throughout Plato's philosophy, the forms are inseparable from spirit and from life. Ideas are not fixed eternal objects existing in isolation. They nourish intelligence because they themselves are intelligible realities, almost like intellectual beings. They are the very source from which thought proceeds. Plato never explicitly says, forms are living beings, but in several key passages he unmistakably describes the intelligible realm as populated by living, ensouled, divine beings. I would say that forms or ideas in themselves are not living organisms, but they are intellectual realities. They possess intellect within themselves. In Plato's philosophy, intelligence does not produce ideas. It is the opposite. Ideas produce intelligence. They are intellectual powers. They contain the power of intelligence, and intelligence receives this power from ideas. Each idea by itself is not an intelligent creature, but it can be described as one single intellectual unit. In fact, I would say this is the only reasonable way to describe it. Each idea is a unit of intellect. What we call intelligence is the power of receiving many of these units and filtering them into power of thinking. Also, Plato says that all souls and living organisms, meaning life itself, is created through the power of the forms that the demiurge receives and filters through his power of thinking. To put it as bluntly as possible, he literally says that life is created through numerical and geometric patterns. He thinks that mathematics literally contains power of life. Numbers contain spirit within themselves. They are spirits. Each number and each shape is a kind of living intellect. Not exactly like a living soul, but we can compare it to a distinction and relationship between a biological organism and a living cell. The soul or intellectual being can be seen as a living intellectual organism, while numerical and geometric patterns are like living cells that make the building blocks of this intellectual organism. For example, in the Timaeus Plato writes, "The model contained all the living beings, and the god, wishing to make this world like that model, made the world contain all the living beings that are its natural parts. These are 4 in number: gods, birds, creatures that live in water, and creatures that live on land." Now, what are these living beings that the model contained? Is this just how the demiurge received power to create living beings, or he directly met higher living beings and created their lower counterparts? I will leave this to your contemplation. But regardless, what I want to say is that this realm of forms contains intelligence and spirit of life, because in Plato's dialogues all life directly comes from that place. How this intelligence and life is expressed within the realm of forms is uncertain, but it is clear that life or power that life needs to live comes from that place. Modern Platonists often reduce the forms to abstract entities such as numbers, sets, or propositions, but Plato never presents them in this way. The forms are not concepts grasped by reason. They are living, intelligible realities. Likewise, Plato's mathematics is not a form of physics expressed through numbers. It is a sacred geometry that reveals the structure of both the soul and the cosmos. The form of the good is described by Plato as the light of the mind. In other words, the good directly grants the power of thought to every intellect. Plato believed that the cosmos is a living organism fashioned by God, who creates through the intellectual power received from the form of the good. By participating in the eternal forms, God brings forth souls, living beings, and the entire universe. The world soul itself receives life through the eternal forms. Consequently, mathematical realities are not merely eternal objects existing outside the world, they are the very principles through which life exists. Plato even teaches that the universe is a living creature whose structure is shaped through numbers and geometrical harmony. Here is another strange passage from the Timaeus. This one might be the strangest of all when it comes to this topic. Just listen to this very carefully. Plato writes it like this: "Now the god wished that all things should be good and nothing bad, so far as this was attainable. Therefore, when he took in hand to bring this universe into order, he fashioned it out of all the fire, water, air, and earth that were visible, making them as perfect as possible. And since he wanted to make it a living creature, he made it a single visible living creature containing all living creatures within itself. He fashioned it to resemble the intelligible living creature, which is one, and in this way he made this universe one, a single visible living creature containing all living creatures within itself." Don't you think this is a strange way to put it? A living creature that is one, and that the universe is made to resemble. What is this intelligible living creature that the universe is made to resemble? It is clearly not the universe itself, because the universe is made to resemble it. And it is not just described as an abstraction, it clearly says living creature. What this means exactly I do not know, but I am sure it is connected to the forms and living power within them. At last, Plato clearly says in the Timaeus that everything that the demiurge does is according to the perfect model. He in fact says it is a kind of copy, but what this actually means is uncertain. I do not think we can take it literally like many people do, and they speak about the absurdities like tableness or chairness that all tables or chairs are made from. This is not how I would interpret ideas. It is much more fluid and mystical. It is not rigidly defined like many modern scientifically oriented Platonists describe it. I wouldn't even call them objects. Plato never says forms are objects. He calls them ideas, a term that is much more associated with life and spirit. I do not wish to rush to conclusions, but this kind of conception resembles a Valentinian teachings of higher and lower beings. They describe higher and lower Sophia, higher and lower human, higher and lower eons. Everything that is expressed in a lower world has its universal archetypal counterpart in the higher. However, Valentinian teachings are much more clear about the nature and life of these higher beings. It is clear that they are drawing it from Plato, and this is precisely why I actually believe that they improve Plato's picture in this respect. But this is a discussion for another video. Let's return to Plato. It seems that even living beings, like Cosmos, whom Plato considers to be a divine creature, also apparently has his counterpart or a model. How to interpret this I do not know, but I would suggest that it clearly shows a heavy connection between life that living creatures receive from this model or realm of forms. If everything in the material world is made according to or as a copy of ideas, then living beings, along with their living aspect, must be the same. This means that life itself or the soul is a form of idea. Plato even says in multiple dialogues that soul resembles the forms, just like the cosmos resembles that intelligible living creature that resides within the noetic sphere. I personally like to think about this idea of the soul through Valentinian concept of the anthropos. It is much more concrete example pointing at practically the same thing, and it is naturally easier to grasp. Valentinians teach that the anthropos, the archetypal human being or universal idea of a human, is the Platonic form or archetype which is present in every human soul. So life or the soul must somehow be made from the forms. They can't be just abstract objects if life itself is modeled according to their nature, and I believe it is clear that Plato thinks this. In the Timaeus, the world soul is literally ordered according to harmonious proportions, and human souls reflect this same pattern. In the Sophist, Plato argues that true being, which includes forms, must be alive. He writes, "If we are to say that being is anything, we must not say that it is lifeless or devoid of intelligence, for it would be absurd to think that what truly is has no life or thought. Therefore, being must possess soul and intelligence." In the Republic, Plato introduces what he calls the human number, representing the harmony of human souls within the cycles of the cosmos. As these cosmic cycles unfold, the relationship between humanity and the universal order changes, and this harmony is expressed through a kind of sacred mathematics. Because of this, Plato teaches that the soul can ascend through philosophical contemplation toward a suprarational intuition, directly experiencing eternal truth. These truths already exist within the soul because the highest form, the form of the good, is present as the source of every other form and is at the same time the source of all thinking. Since the good grants both existence to the forms and the power of thought itself, the soul is capable not merely of understanding the forms but of becoming like them by embodying their harmony. Plato also teaches that the soul can rise beyond theories and hypotheses. This means that it can transcend every abstraction, because the forms themselves are not abstractions but the concrete reality of meaning, inseparably united with intelligence and life. The soul can attain a condition in which eternal truth is no longer merely contemplated but fully embodied and directly experienced through spirit. At this stage, the distinction between hypothesis and truth disappears. Truth is no longer something reached through argument alone. The soul participates in it immediately, seeing beyond every hypothesis while living eternal truth from within. At this highest level, language and reality become one. Theories cease to be mere theories and become living expressions of reality itself, experienced directly through the life of the soul. Plato's epistemology can be described as a form of mysticism inseparable from reason and ecstatic experience. True ecstasy is achieved through the harmonization of the soul by means of reason, as illustrated in the Symposium, where love, or eros, is gradually directed toward the divine. The lover of wisdom does not simply engage in logical reasoning. Instead, love itself becomes the force that lifts the soul upward toward the divine. Philosophy is not merely cold intellectual analysis. It is the soul's passionate longing for intelligible reality. Dialectic is simply eros brought into harmony and order. For this reason, Plato describes the philosopher as a lover of wisdom rather than merely someone who thinks about wisdom. The ascent toward the forms is simultaneously a religious, erotic, and noetic journey in which desire, reason, and divine reality become a single movement of the soul. This is why the lover in the Symposium ascends through the ladder of love, while the philosopher in the Republic climbs through the ladder of dialectic. These are not different paths, but different expressions of the very same ascent. We also must understand that Plato does not speak about eros as an emotion from a subjective human perspective. He speaks about it as a cosmic force that rules us, and we must adapt to its influence by receiving its power into our soul and filtering it into reality through thought and action. Plato's conception of Eros is likely influenced by the Orphic tradition. In some versions, the Orphic egg which contains Eros is created by Kronos. Then Eros bore Nyx or Night as his daughter and took her as his consort. Eros was called protogonos, meaning firstborn, because he was the first of the immortals that could be conceived by man, and was thought of as the creator of all other beings and the first ruler of the universe. In Philebus, Plato describes the intelligible order as composed of divine living beings. He writes the following: "We must assume that in the heavens, and in the whole universe, there exist gods and divine beings, endowed with intelligence and care for the whole. These beings possess the eternal nature of the good, and they are living beings of the highest order." So is it not a little bit difficult to conclude that ideas are just abstract objects that we simply know through rational thinking? It seems that they are much closer to some kind of spiritual order that extends throughout the entire reality from top to bottom. Throughout the history of philosophy, Plato has often been portrayed as a skeptic because he appears to distrust empirical knowledge. This interpretation usually comes from his epistemology, particularly the allegory of the cave, where sensory reality is represented by the cave while the realm of ideas lies beyond it. Yet Plato is not claiming that our senses deceive us by presenting false information. Quite the opposite. We are deceived by the truth. The senses deceive precisely because they present reality accurately. The deception lies in taking what is correctly perceived as the whole of reality. The shadows on the wall of the cave truly are shadows. They appear exactly as they are. Just as a person walking beneath the sun genuinely casts a shadow, so too the shadows within the cave faithfully represent the shadows cast by the puppets. The cave itself symbolizes material existence, and the information supplied by the senses is entirely correct within its own level of reality. Empirical experience is genuine and truthful. What Plato argues, however, is that this empirical experience can be elevated into knowledge of the absolute. The soul is capable of becoming like God, and Plato expresses this idea in several dialogues. The highest goal is to become like the divine and to participate in a mode of knowing that embraces reality as a whole, just as the gods do. Plato does not use this language merely as a metaphor. He genuinely entertains the possibility that the human soul can attain a divine likeness. In Phaedrus, Plato writes, "Every soul pursues what is divine, and in its best moments rises with the gods to behold true reality. When it follows the gods in this ascent, it becomes orderly, harmonious, and filled with the beauty it contemplates. In such moments the soul becomes most like the divine nature it follows." As yet another quote from Phaedrus says, "The soul that has seen the most of truth follows Zeus and becomes capable of leading others toward justice and wisdom. By contemplating what is truly real, it is nourished and strengthened, becoming similar to the gods in clarity and virtue. This likeness is the soul's greatest joy, for it remembers its own divine origin." In this respect, one could even describe Plato as the most radical defender of experience, because he believed that knowledge could ultimately reach a divine condition. His vision goes beyond ordinary empiricism. Rather than rejecting experience, he expands it beyond the sensory world. Empirical reality becomes only one level within a higher state of knowledge in which the most irreducible building blocks of reality are directly present to our experience. Plato even indicates in a few places that the absolute knowledge, the knowledge of all the forms at once, the way they are connected to each other, and how they provide the underlying structure for reality, meaning the absolute knowledge of everything, could be technically achievable through dialectic. Whether Plato believed that such a condition could ever be fully attained by a human being remains uncertain. However, in the Republic, Plato says that the desire of the philosopher is the only desire that we can truly accomplish, and it is only desire that can truly satisfy the soul, as all other desires are mere avoidance of pain. It is probably an ideal, but nevertheless, it stands as the goal toward which every true lover of wisdom strives. Plato never claimed to have reached this divine state himself, nor did he insist with certainty that any human certainly could. Instead, he explored the possibility. In the Parmenides, He even suggests that an intellect of extraordinary power might be capable of such understanding. Whether a human being possessing such an exceptional intellect could ever exist, however, remains an open question. For this reason, I acknowledge that Plato is not an empiricist in the modern philosophical sense, just as he is not simply a rationalist in the modern sense either. His position belongs to an entirely different framework that modern thought often struggles to understand because our intellectual tradition has moved so far away from it. Plato certainly believes that the soul must experience truth rather than merely define it, debate it, or reduce it to concepts. This encounter with truth is simultaneously erotic, visionary, religious, rational, and fully intelligible. Plato is therefore not an empiricist, but he is certainly an experiential philosopher. Truth must be lived, remembered, contemplated, and encountered directly by the soul. This is why the ascent toward the forms is at once religious, rational, and inspired by love. In Phaedrus, Plato writes, "When the soul grows its wings again through love of beauty, it is lifted upward toward the divine realm. In that ascent it becomes gentle, radiant, and godlike, for it is restored to the vision it once shared with the gods." Plato's direct encounter with the forms is noetic rather than sensory, yet it remains a genuine experience. It is living, ontological, and existential rather than abstract or merely mathematical in the modern sense. The soul can encounter the forms because both the soul and the forms participate in the same ontological reality, founded upon harmony, proportion, number, life, and reason. Modern versions of Platonism, especially those found in analytic metaphysics or mathematical Platonism, preserve little more than the rational framework while discarding everything else. What remains may still bear Plato's name, but it is no longer Plato's philosophy. The entire structure of Plato's metaphysics rests upon the conviction that the soul is divine, and it recognizes the forms because it has already encountered them before its earthly existence, in the divine realm. Not that earth is not divine. Plato describes the cosmos as a divine being, a god that he calls Uranos and Cosmos. However, he understands it as resting between the realm of order and chaos, form and formlessness, being and non-being, with both of these present within its nature constantly moving from one side to the other. He also describes the cosmic cycles that move from order to chaos constantly in eternal motion, and just like each human being has a soul, the cosmos has it too. Each soul is described in the Republic as having 3 parts, and each of these can be connected to the nature of reality and the cosmos. There is the highest, rational part, symbolized by the image of a man. It corresponds to the noetic realm and the rational aspect of the cosmos. There is a middle, spirited part, symbolized by the image of a lion. It corresponds to nature or realm of becoming, the animal aspect of the cosmos. The last part, the lowest aspect of the soul, is desire, symbolized by the image of a 7-headed hydra. It corresponds to chaos and disordered part of the cosmos. Knowledge is therefore not produced through conceptual deduction, but through anamnesis, the soul's recollection of what it once knew. Likewise, the lover in the symposium does not reason abstractly toward beauty itself. The ascent begins with beauty perceived in bodies, continues through beautiful souls, laws, and sciences, and culminates in the sudden vision of beauty itself. This is not an act of logical deduction, but an act of intellectual vision. When the soul encounters beauty, Plato describes it as trembling, growing wings, and remembering its divine origin. These are not simply poetic descriptions of emotion in the modern psychological sense. They express the soul's direct recognition of its own eternal nature. Even in dialogues that appear to be Plato's most rigorously rational works, he insists that the soul must ultimately rise beyond hypotheses and directly contemplate the first principle. This is not abstraction but noesis, an immediate vision of intelligible reality. At the end, I believe I proved my point. Plato's realm of forms is not a mathematical abstraction. It is a sacred dimension populated by divine beings, filled with intelligence, life, and spirit. I personally think that it is reasonable to conclude that we can't go so far as to say that each idea or form is a living being. However, forms or ideas are filled with living spirit that nourishes the existence of living reality that is completely filled with intelligent life from top to bottom. Modern scientifically minded Platonists mostly do not acknowledge this divine dimension within Platonism, and I am afraid we must conclude that if this is the case, they are not truly Platonists.